The first thing I noticed wasn't the light, it was the car. A dark blue SUV I'd never seen before sat in the driveway of the lake house my husband and I had owned for nearly 16 years. It wasn't parked like someone making a quick stop. It was backed neatly into the space beside the garage, exactly the way David always parked our own cars. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers started to ache. For a moment, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe David had loaned the place to a coworker. Maybe a neighbor had asked to use the driveway. Maybe... But deep down, there was a feeling I couldn't name. A cold certainty that settled in my stomach before I even stepped out of the car. Some instincts don't scream, they whisper, and they're almost always right. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 46 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had the kind of marriage people quietly envied. David and I had been together for 23 years. We weren't perfect, no couple is. He had a habit of avoiding difficult conversations, convincing himself that if he ignored a problem long enough, it might disappear. I was the opposite. I wanted everything out in the open, even if the truth hurt. It had caused arguments over the years, but we'd always found our way back to each other. Or at least, I thought we had. We built a comfortable life in Bellevue, just outside Seattle. We raised our daughter Emma, who was now away at graduate school. I owned a small interior design studio, while David worked as a financial consultant. We weren't wealthy enough to be featured in magazines, but we had everything we'd ever dreamed about. A warm home, financial stability, friends who felt like family, and a small Cedar Lake house 2 hours north that had become our favorite place on earth. David proposed to me on the dock behind that house. Well, behind the land where the house would eventually stand. Back then it was nothing but trees, muddy shoreline, and impossible dreams. We spent years saving for it. Weekends covered in sawdust, vacations spent painting walls instead of traveling. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen cabinets were crooked because we'd installed them ourselves. The fireplace had tiny scratches from the Christmas our golden retriever decided to chase a squirrel indoors. Even the porch swing creaked in exactly the same rhythm it had for over a decade. That house wasn't expensive. It was priceless. Because it held our history. Or so I believed. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My younger brother called while I was meeting with a client. Our mother had suffered a massive stroke. I barely remember driving to the hospital. The doctors spoke in careful, measured sentences that somehow felt colder than if they'd simply delivered bad news. The next few months will be critical. She'll need constant supervision. Recovery is possible, but it won't be easy. There was never really a decision to make. Mom lived nearly 3 hours away in a quiet coastal town. She had no one else. My brother worked on offshore oil rigs and was gone for weeks at a time. Hiring full-time care wasn't realistic, and honestly, even if it had been, I couldn't imagine leaving her with strangers. She'd spent her entire life putting everyone else first. Now it was my turn. David didn't hesitate. "I'll take care of everything here," he told me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders while I packed a suitcase that evening. "You stay with your mom as long as she needs you." I kissed him. I thanked him. I thought I'd married the kindest man in the world. Looking back, I wonder if guilt had already started hiding behind his smile. Life quickly became smaller. Every morning started before sunrise. Medication schedules, physical therapy, doctor appointments, laundry, groceries. Cooking meals Mom barely had the strength to finish. Some days she remembered what year it was. Other days she looked at me with frightened eyes, unable to remember my name for several heartbreaking minutes. I stopped checking social media, stopped answering most phone calls, stopped caring about anything beyond helping her take one more step, lift one more spoonful, say one more complete sentence. The outside world simply faded away. David called every evening. At first, he asked about Mom, told me he loved me, promised he'd come visit that weekend. Then work became crazy. The visits moved to every other weekend, then once a month. Eventually they stopped altogether. The phone calls became shorter too. 5 minutes, then 3. Sometimes less than 60 seconds. I'm exhausted. I've got an early meeting. I'll call tomorrow. Tomorrow often became next week. I noticed it. Of course I did. But loneliness has a strange way of lowering your expectations. I kept telling myself he was carrying our entire life on his own. The mortgage, the business paperwork, the taxes, the repairs, everything I'd left behind. If anything, I felt guilty for leaving him with so much responsibility. It never occurred to me that he might be using my absence for something else entirely. About 4 months into Mom's recovery, David mentioned something during one of our brief phone calls, almost as an afterthought. "Oh, by the way," he said casually, "I found someone to stay at the lake house for a while." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know how empty houses attract problems. Broken pipes, break-ins, stuff like that. A friend from work knows a woman who's going through a divorce. She just needs a temporary place to stay." He said it so naturally, like he was telling me he'd replaced a smoke detector battery. I hesitated. The lake house had never been rented, never loaned out, not once. It was our sanctuary. "Who is she?" I asked. "Just someone who needs help." That answer should have bothered me. Instead, exhaustion answered for me. "If you think it's the right thing, I do. I trust you." There was a brief silence, long enough for him to realize exactly what I just handed him. My trust. Completely, without conditions, without questions. "I love you," he finally said. "I love you too." When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly felt uneasy. Not suspicious, just unsettled, as if something invisible had shifted while I wasn't looking. I ignored the feeling, because I had bigger things to worry about. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, my mother's doctor finally gave us the news I'd been praying to hear. "She's stable enough," he said with a reassuring smile. "She'll still need help, but the worst appears to be behind her." For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Mom insisted I go home for a few days. "You look more exhausted than I do," she joked, her voice still weak but stronger than it had been in months. I smiled, though guilt immediately settled in my chest. Leaving her, even for a weekend, felt selfish. But she reached for my hand. "You can't pour from an empty cup, sweetheart." Those words stayed with me during the 3-hour drive back towards Seattle. I decided not to tell David I was coming. I wanted to surprise him. It had been nearly 6 months since we'd spent more than a single evening together. I imagined walking through the front door, cooking dinner together, maybe opening one of the bottles of wine we'd been saving. I missed my husband, or maybe I missed the man I thought he still was. When I pulled into our driveway, his car wasn't there. That didn't seem strange. It was only Thursday afternoon. He was probably still at work. Inside, the house looked different. Not dramatically, just enough to make me pause. The living room smelled unfamiliar, as though someone had been burning expensive candles I never would have bought. The throw pillows had been rearranged. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen island. David had never bought flowers, not unless I reminded him. I laughed at myself. Maybe he'd finally started paying attention. Maybe this was his way of welcoming me home. But then I opened the refrigerator. Almost everything inside was something I never ate. Almond milk, Greek yogurt with peach flavor, fresh raspberries, gluten-free wraps. David hated yogurt. He couldn't stand raspberries, and I'd never once bought almond milk. For a long moment, I simply stared. People change, I told myself. Maybe he'd started eating healthier. Maybe that word had become my favorite lie. Maybe, maybe, maybe. I unpacked my bag and walked upstairs. Our bedroom was spotless, too spotless. The comforter had been tucked in with perfect corners. The dresser held almost nothing except David's watch and wallet. He'd never been this tidy, not once in 23 years. A quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that someone else had been cleaning. I ignored it. That evening, David came home carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. His smile looked genuine. He hugged me tightly. For a moment, I almost cried. "I've missed you," he said. "I've missed you too." We ate dinner on the patio. He asked about Mom. I asked about work. The conversation felt careful, as though we were both reading from scripts neither of us had written. Whenever I mentioned the lake house, he changed the subject. Whenever I asked about weekends, he answered vaguely. "Busy, lots of projects, just trying to stay afloat." It wasn't what he said, it was what he avoided saying. Later that night, while he was showering, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to snoop, honestly. I reached for it because I assumed it might be our daughter. The screen lit up before I touched it. "Thank you again. I finally feel like I have a real home." No name, just a heart emoji beside an unsaved number. I froze. Seconds later, another message appeared. "I made your favorite coffee this morning. Hope your meeting went well." The air left my lungs. Coffee, not the coffee. Your favorite coffee. The kind of sentence people say after sharing dozens of mornings together. I put the phone back exactly where it had been. When David walked out of the bathroom, smiling as he dried his hair, I forced myself to smile back. I didn't ask about the messages, not because I trusted him, because I wanted to hear the truth before he had time to invent a lie. The next morning, David left early for work, or at least that's what he said. I waited exactly 20 minutes before getting into my car. I felt ridiculous. 46 years old, following my own husband. This wasn't who I was. Yet something inside me refused to let it go. His SUV stayed on the interstate for nearly an hour. Then he took the exit leading north, toward the lake, toward the house. I stayed several cars behind him. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Please let there be an explanation. Please. Instead, I watched him pull into the driveway of our lake house. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight inside, like a man coming home. I parked half a mile away and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs. She looked to be in her late 30s. She wore an oversized sweater. Her dark hair was tied into a loose ponytail. She looked ordinary, not glamorous, not intimidating, just comfortable, as if she'd lived there for years. She handed 1 mug to David. He smiled. Not politely, not out of kindness. It was the relaxed smile I'd spent 23 years believing belonged only to me. Then she reached up and brushed a speck of dust from his jacket. The gesture was so natural, so intimate, it made my stomach twist. But what happened next confused me even more. David didn't kiss her. He didn't hold her hand. Instead, they stood side by side in complete silence, staring across the lake. Like 2 people carrying the same invisible weight. I couldn't understand it. If she was his mistress, why did they look so sad? Why did neither of them seem happy? For another 15 minutes, I watched from a distance. Then an elderly man arrived in a pickup truck. He hugged the woman tightly. David stepped back, giving them space. The 3 of them spoke quietly before the older man left again. Nothing about it fit the story I'd been building in my head. As I drove away, I realized something that frightened me even more than the possibility of an affair. I had finally found answers, and somehow they only created bigger questions. I didn't confront David that day. Every instinct told me to storm into the house, demand answers, and force him to explain what I'd just seen. 23 years of marriage deserved at least that much. But another part of me, the quieter, more rational part, kept asking the same question. If that woman was his mistress, why had there been no kiss? Why had they looked more like 2 exhausted people sharing bad news than lovers building a secret life? For 2 days, I said nothing. I smiled through dinner. I answered his questions. I pretended everything was normal. Meanwhile, I quietly gathered the pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The first clue came from our bank account. There were regular payments to pharmacies and medical equipment suppliers. Thousands of dollars over several months. I hadn't authorized them. Neither had David mentioned them. The second clue came from our insurance records. A temporary resident had officially been registered at the lake house. Her name was Hannah Brooks, 38 years old. Widowed. Not divorced. Widowed. That single word shattered my first assumption. Nothing about this made sense anymore. The next morning, I drove back to the lake house. This time, I wasn't going to hide. When I knocked, it wasn't David who answered. It was Hannah. She looked surprised to see me, then frightened. "You must be Claire," she said quietly. She already knew my name. I felt anger rising inside me. "So you know who I am?" She lowered her eyes. "I do." "Then you also know this is my house." She nodded. "I've wanted to meet you for months." Months. The word echoed in my head. Before I could respond, David walked into the hallway. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Finally, he whispered my name. "Claire." I looked at both of them. "I've given you one chance in 23 years to explain yourself," I said. "Don't waste it." David asked me to sit down. I almost walked away. Instead, I stayed. It turned out that the truth was nothing like the story I had imagined. 8 months earlier, David had been involved in a minor car accident. No one was seriously injured, or so he believed. The other driver was Hannah's husband. A few weeks later, the man suffered a brain hemorrhage caused by an undiagnosed injury connected to the accident. He died. Although investigators ruled it an accident and David was never charged, he blamed himself every single day. He attended the funeral without telling me because I was already living with my mother in the hospital. There he met Hannah. She wasn't angry. She was simply broken. She had no family, no children, no savings. Her husband's medical bills had consumed almost everything. She was about to lose her apartment. David couldn't live with the guilt. He offered to let her stay in the lake house temporarily. He paid some of her expenses anonymously. He helped her meet lawyers and financial advisors. He visited to make sure she was okay. Then why had he lied? I asked him exactly that. His answer hurt more than I expected. Because every time I tried to tell you, he said, your mother had another setback. Every conversation became, maybe next week. Then another month passed. Then another. He looked down. And after that, I was ashamed. Hannah finally spoke. I begged him to tell you. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned carrying a small envelope. Inside were several handwritten letters, all addressed to me. None had been mailed. The first one read, Claire, you don't know me, but I'm living in your lake house because your husband refused to let me become homeless. I know how wrong this looks. I've asked him over and over to tell you the truth. There were 6 letters, one for nearly every month I'd been away. Every one ended the same way. I'm sorry. I looked at David. You should have trusted me. I know. You let me believe my marriage was falling apart. I know. You let another woman live in the one place that meant everything to us. Tears filled his eyes. I thought I was protecting everyone. You weren't. I know. For the first time in our marriage, David didn't defend himself. He accepted every accusation because they were true. Helping Hannah hadn't been the betrayal. Lying to me had. Keeping me outside my own marriage had. Making decisions for both of us had. That wound was deeper than infidelity. Weeks passed before I could think clearly. Mom continued recovering. Emma came home after hearing pieces of what had happened. She expected screaming, divorce papers, a family explosion. Instead, she found 3 adults trying to untangle the consequences of one terrible decision. Hannah moved into a small apartment after finding a full-time job. Before leaving, she handed me the spare key to the lake house. I never wanted to take anything from you, she said. I know. She hesitated. Your husband isn't a bad man. No, I answered honestly. He made a very bad choice. Months later, David and I sat on the dock where he'd proposed 23 years earlier. The silence between us felt different now. Not empty, honest. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, he admitted. I stared across the lake. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for once. He nodded. I know. It's something you earn. He didn't promise that everything would go back to the way it had been. Neither did I. Some things, once broken, never fit together exactly as before. But they can still become something strong, just different. It took nearly a year. Counseling, long conversations, uncomfortable truths, and countless moments when walking away would have been easier than staying. Our marriage survived, not because love erased the damage, but because the truth finally replaced the lies. Looking back now, I realize the other woman was never the greatest threat to my marriage. Silence was. Secrets were. The belief that protecting someone from the truth is kinder than trusting them with it. If David had told me everything on the very first day, I would have stood beside him. Instead, he stood alone, and in doing so, nearly lost the person he had been trying to protect all along. That's the hardest lesson I have ever learned. Sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't another person. It's deciding that the one you love can't handle the truth. If you've made it this far, I genuinely love to know what you think. Could you forgive someone who lied to protect another person, even if there was no affair? Or would the secrecy alone be enough to end the marriage? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear where you stand.